This is a review of the 1956 Richard Quine film, The Solid Gold Cadillac, starring Judy Holliday and a bunch of character actors. It's got a bunch of faces you will probably recognize if you've seen any sort of 1950s television or movie. It's even got Richard Deacon in it, who played Melvin Cooley in The Dick Van Dyke Show, and a bunch of others. I think this movie's best described as if Frank Capra had directed The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and it starred Thelma Ritter. But not only will I describe this movie you've never heard of by comparing it to a bunch of other movies you've never heard of, I'll try and actually give some insight into what this is like and how to go about watching it if you should feel like doing so. In general, I think this movie is worth watching. It's pretty funny and pretty interesting. I think it's worth watching just from sort of entertainment perspective to some degree, and it's also a pretty interesting, had some pretty interesting lessons about movies, particularly in the 50s, particularly how we look at sort of capitalism versus populism in the sort of 50s and whatnot. This movie begins with a dedication to minority shareholders in companies. As we'll see, it has sort of an idyllic view of just what a minority shareholder is, but it opens at a shareholder meeting of a big company, sort of this, I forget their name, but some sort of huge conglomerate holding company sort of thing. And it begins by introducing sort of interesting stylistic choice. It introduces with a freeze frame each of the sort of executives on the board, and the narrator, George Burns, talks about how each of them is crooked, basically. There's a woman there, played by Judy Holliday, who owns 10 shares of this company, and yet has some questions for the hotshots leading the conglomerate, such as, why do you get paid so much? And things like that. She's really a thorn in their side at this shareholder meeting, and that is basically what sets off the entire plot. Before we go any further, I don't know a lot about Judy Holliday, but I think I'm going to be figuring out more, because she is great in this movie and an obvious comedic talent, even if there's some sort of complexities to how her character is spun. Judy Holliday, obviously a really talented actress. She won an Academy Award for the movie Born Yesterday, which came out in 1950, I think. I haven't seen that, but I think I may check it out and look into some of the other things that she's done. So like I said, she has sort of Thelma Ritter vibes to some extent, but is a bit younger. You just have to sort of get a sense of it by watching, I think. But sort of Jewish, sort of partly naive, but also partly shrewd kind of character and whatnot, which is pretty interesting. Another thing that's kind of interesting about her character in this movie, and the other one of the other main characters in the movie, who's the former chairman of this company, who leaves the company to go to Washington, and later develops a relationship with Judy Holliday's character, is that they're both a little bit older than typical movies. So this is one of the first things that's a bit atypical about this movie, is that not only is it led by sort of an atypical star, right? Judy Holliday's character, I think, in a lot of other sort of contexts, you'd expect her to be a supporting actress, like a Thelma Ritter type of sort of character and whatnot. Now, she did win an Academy Award for, actress in a leading role and whatnot, but she kind of feels like a supporting actress in many ways, or like sort of comedic relief in many ways. And having her carry the whole movie is pretty interesting. But she's also not, she's not your typical starlet in a number of ways. One of them is her character, but part of that is her age as well. So I think she was in her 30s or whatever when she made this movie, which is not old by any means, but I think just sort of the way the character is angled, maybe in part because the character is sort of visibly Jewish in some ways, she doesn't seem to fit into the same kind of position that sort of like a cover, like it's some sort of pinup glamorous actress would fit into and whatnot. That's not me saying that Jews can't be these glamorous actors and whatnot, but it's that there's the role that was sort of created. Like I said, it's more kind of like a Thelma Ritter-esque character to some way. So already pretty early on, the movie gets off to a pretty interesting start by sort of centering on this character that you wouldn't totally expect, who's a bit older in particular, and she goes on to have a romantic relationship potentially, at least, with the departing CEO, who's also a little bit older and whatnot. Now, of course, it's fairly common to have older men in these movies and whatnot, preying on or romancing with younger women. But this is a little bit different because this character is, McKeever is his name in the movie. He is not your sort of suave Claude Rains romantic male lead by any means. He's kind of a hardworking, good American CEO and whatnot. He's the one businessman who's actually honest in this movie. He leaves the company at the very beginning to go to Washington and whatnot, where interestingly, the Senate is totally dishonest and unproductive in the movie, which is kind of funny. And he's tormented by having to work with them and whatnot. While meanwhile, the people that he left behind at the company begin defrauding investors and trying all kinds of schemes and whatnot. But like I said, he's not your romantic lead. He's kind of a slightly goofy character in some ways. The thing that physically sets him apart is the guy is big, not sort of your typical slender, handsome kind of guy, but more of like almost sort of an avuncular or father-like kind of figure and whatnot. And so the romantic plot at the beginning of it feels remarkably fresh in some ways because you're seeing slightly different characters, but it also just puts this movie into slightly sort of uncommon territory because your main character and the second most important character, like I said, they both are characters that in most movies would not be the main two characters in the movie. They'd be supporting characters and whatnot. So I think you get the idea, but already we're into slightly interesting territory. Now, of course, like I said, the movie starts with this dedication to the shareholders. It starts with the shareholder meeting, which is also pretty interesting because we are seeing this sort of capitalism versus populism. I invoked the great Frank Capra in the beginning to touch on this populist idea and whatnot, right? So Frank Capra made a bunch of movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, where the average sort of middle America guy, this sort of shrewd but simple outsider comes to sort of the capitalist or the government establishment and calls out corruption and complication and inefficiency and whatnot and brings common sense, right, to capitalism or something along those lines. Now, Judy Holliday's character isn't quite the same because she is used a little bit more for comedic value as being a bit backwards and whatnot. And in some ways, it takes a little while to figure out which way the movie is going to go to some degree because there's sort of equal weight given to her character being a naive outsider, but also shrewd and whatnot. So it takes you a little bit of time to figure out, is she supposed to be this sort of annoying person who doesn't know what the heck is going on, or is she actually pretty clever and sly? And this ambivalence is really linked to a kind of underlying ambivalence, an underlying tension between populism and sort of mainstream capitalism, right? So this movie is a comedy. It's a satire, and it is surprisingly edgy. It has a couple of legitimately great jokes in it. It's actually pretty funny at times, not throughout, but there's maybe 3, I think, legitimately great jokes in this movie. There's also a couple of jokes that are way more edgy than you would expect. And a lot of these are lampooning the sort of corporate America and whatnot, which is interesting because Hollywood is sort of inherently connected to corporate America, and it's hard to find movies that really go all in with their critiques. Exactly. Well, it's complicated, but this movie is kind of caught in that. So it teeters towards being more populist at times, and then it will sort of and ridiculing, satirizing this sort of corporate America, and then it will sort of swing back the other way at times. And I won't give away anything about the movie because the plot of this movie is actually pretty interesting and pretty clever. Sometimes when I watch sort of modern movies, dramas, or thrillers and whatnot that don't have twists or clever endings, it's fairly common to find modern movies where it sort of there's all they have all the tension, they have all the atmosphere, but it felt like when they were writing the script, just nobody could come up with a good twist or nobody could come up with a clever plot or something like that. Well, this movie, and most movies of the 50s, makes you realize, I don't know, maybe they used them all up or something like that, but this movie definitely has a trick or two up its sleeve. The pacing is slightly odd at times. In particular, well, I won't get into it, but there's one sort of plot line in sort of the final third of the movie that comes and goes a little bit unexpectedly and whatnot. But overall, a really tight script that actually comes together quite nicely. Legitimately funny jokes at times. Surprisingly edgy jokes at times. So a pretty entertaining movie in general, but also a movie that is completely characterized by this ambivalence, by this uncertainty about what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to bring together this sort of like nice middle America minority shareholder and whatnot, but also corporate America and things. I won't spoil it, but I will mention that the solid gold Cadillac does show up in the movie towards the end, and its presence puts another interesting spin on this. And the ultimate conclusion of the movie puts another interesting spin on this, where there's no clear resolution exactly. This certainly is not a subversive movie, even though it is a satirical movie. That's one way to put it. And that is extremely, extremely common and whatnot. But this movie, I think, pretty good. I think it's rated 7.4 on IMDb with under 2,000 votes or something like that. And that's seems fair. Maybe, let's see. No, 7.5 with 1.6K votes, 1,600 votes. That seems a pretty fair. This is, like I said, an uncommon movie in a number of ways. Kind of an interesting movie, fairly enjoying it to watch. And it's interesting to see the sort of mechanics of understanding populism versus capitalism that completely play out in this movie in fairly explicit terms, and to watch the movie teeter, as so many of these classic movies that have to contend with the mainstream or just other tensions do. And like I said, Judy Holliday is great in this movie. The final thing I would say is that I get some just early vibes. You wonder if this could have been the inspiration for a character like Elle Woods, who also has this sort of naive outsider thing going on, but also an unexpected shrewdness at times, and who also goes up against sort of a mainstream institution and destabilizes it, but in the end, perhaps ultimately doesn't exactly subvert it. Let's just put it that way. Interesting comparison there. Perhaps Judy Holliday was the inspiration for it all. Who knows? But in general, pretty fun movie and a pretty interesting movie that I think is worth watching. This is The Solid Gold Cadillac, starring Judy Holliday.